All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Wellness Wednesday. Do we all age the same way? Where we're going to learn about some sex differences in muscle and brain functions. So my name is Alex Barber-Cross, and I'm a research program assistant and exercise instructor here at the Brain Wellness Program. And I'm really happy to be serving as your MC for today's event. So May is Women's Health Month, so we hope to highlight the importance of sex-specific research, which is crucial for promoting and understanding women's health. As such, we are joined today by two very special guests who will be sharing their research on sex differences in age-related functions. Dr. Jennifer Jakobi will start us off by speaking about the motor system and how motor function changes with age and sex. And then Dr. Annalise Laplume will share her expertise on sex differences and the effect of aging on the brain. Unfortunately, Dr. Natasha Raja was unable to make it to today's event, but we are very lucky to have Dr. Laplume, who is a postdoctoral fellow, co-supervised by both Dr. Raja and Dr. Sylvie Belleville at McGill University, who is joining us here today. So before we get started, I'd first like to acknowledge that the BC Brain Wellness Program at the Jakobi Mapagian Centre for Brain Health is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam peoples. I'm joining you here from Vancouver, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And as all of you are joining us from different places today, I encourage us all to take a moment to reflect and give thanks to the lands with which we are privileged to work, learn, and play from. I would also like to take a moment to thank all of our program donors for supporting the BC Brain Wellness Program. Because of your generosity, we are able to provide these educational events and our online classes. As an entirely donor-funded program, we do rely on your generosity to ensure the continuation and development of our program. So we would like to thank you all for your ongoing support. So without further ado, I will introduce our first guest, Dr. Jennifer Jakobi. Dr. Jakobi leads the Aging in Place Research Cluster, which supports the needs and choices of older women and men to age in place by maintaining active living, functional independence, and social and emotional health. She also leads her own basic research lab centered upon identifying neural pathways that modulate force control in women, which can inform the design of exercise programs to maintain functional independence in older individuals. In addition to all of her expertise in exercise neuroscience, she is also the BC and Yukon Chair for Women in Science and Engineering for the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada. Dr. Jakobi, thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise today, and I'll now pass the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to share some of the observations and results we have from the lab, as well as a little bit from the literature with respect to muscle strength and the preservation of force control. So before I go any further, it would be wrong of me not to identify the wonderful group of trainees that I've had over the years working in the lab that have produced the wonderful findings that I'm going to share with you today. And I acknowledge their hard work, as well as the work of funding agencies from CIHR, NSERC, and the Social Sciences and Health Research Humanities Research Council of Canada. So without further ado, what I hope to present in the next 20 minutes or so is kind of give you an overview of who we are as far as older Canadian men and women. And then I want to highlight some sex-specific age-related changes that occur with respect to functional decline, as well as force steadiness. I'd like to highlight some underlying causes, and then most importantly, talk about how strength training can benefit, especially females as we age, and then wrap up. So let's get going here. If we look at this particular graph in front of you, it can be a little bit confusing, but what I want you to focus on first is the yellow line across the top. What that yellow line indicates is an equal proportion of males to females in Canada. And that equal proportion of a sex ratio can occur across all age groups. What the blue line is showing you is the proportion based upon age groups. And what's really interesting, if we look at the proportion of the number of males per 100 females, as we approach the year 50, there's about equal males to females at 50 years of age. As you notice, this blue line does experience a drastic decline. From those of us who are out and about in society, it's no shocker that as you become older, the number of males to females drastically declines. So between the ages of 85 to 89 years, there's about 68 males to every 99 to 100 females. So there's a definite disproportion of males to females in Canadian society. This proportion alone indicates that we need to focus on studying not just males, but females. And that is especially important because the literature generally has undertaken research on males and just assumed that it applies to females. We're slowly correcting this wrong over a period of number of years. What do we know about functional decline, especially as it relates to males to females? Well, first off, we know mobility declines drastically with increasing age. There's various different factors that contribute to this, and there's numerous ways that we've had to measure it. But overall, as you get older, you become slower and your amount of mobility decreases with increased age. We also know that women are at a higher risk than men for functional dependence, in part related to the decline in functional mobility, but also related to elements of disability and elements of frailty. So women have a higher prevalence of frailty than men. What do we know about functional movement? Well, first off, functional movement is really complex. And if we want to study functional movement, we have to think about it from the level of planning the movement, so in our brain, all the way to sending that message down our spinal cord, out towards our muscle. There's various different levels that this movement can be created, built, and be successful. But that also means there's many places where adaptations can occur with age. And how do we measure those adaptations in really complex movements, such as shown here on the screen? Something that you do every day, drinking a glass of water, is hard because there's so many different ways and places that we need to consider. So what we do in the lab is break these functional movements down into very simple tasks. These simple tasks can be measured through different movements of single limb movements, such as a finger muscle here. We can measure them through hand grip, shown in the middle panel on the top left, or we can measure them through clinical hand dexterity tests. All of these simple tasks have been shown to represent the ability to execute functional movement. These simple tasks, though, how we quantify functional movement in the lab through various different physiological measures that I'm showing in the arm, is have individuals produce steady contractions. So on the bottom right-hand panel, what I'm showing is a very simple movement. It could be such as this finger muscle trying to push or pull in one direction. So all of the movements that I'm going to share with you today are simple tasks where one joint is asked to produce a force, so contract and lift up, hold a force, and then release that force to a given target level shown on the black lines. What you can see here on the top panel is how steady a young male is, where how unsteady an old male is. There's drastic fluctuations in these lines. We quantify the fluctuations in these lines, and the quantification indicates the ability of these older adults to execute a functional task. But since they're simple movements, they enable us to understand where causes of decline are occurring and how they differ between males and females. So the first thing I want to share with you is if you focus on the bottom right-hand panel, what this panel is projecting is the task on the third panel on the top left. It's the ability to lift up a peg and place that peg in a systematic fashion in a hole. And if we look at the predicted versus the actual pegboard time across young, middle-aged, and older adults, if we look at how steady an older adult is in producing this force task that we give them, or in the maximal grip strength, if we add these two variables together, so how steady they are and how strong they are as individuals, we can predict 36% of the variance in pegboard time by these two factors. But then the question becomes, what do these two factors mean? What contributes to force steadiness? What contributes to strength? And how do they differ between males and females? So the first thing, let's focus on this steadiness task within itself. So on the y-axis on the left panel, this is showing you our measure of steadiness. Don't be confused, because the higher the number, the less steadier you are. So it's a normalized value. So if individuals or groups are clustering really close to the baseline, they're really steady. In this particular graph, the males, shown in the dark circles, are always lower than the females. That means they're steadier than the females. And this applies across all force levels. But what I also want to highlight is that down at the bottom here, you become a lot more steadier. So individuals are steadier with higher forces. So the heavier the load, the steadier the contraction, and females are less steadier than males. And this applies across various different positions of the forearm. And when you think about reaching forward and lifting a glass and then putting that glass back down, or eating or self-grooming, all of these tasks involve rotation of the forearm. And rotation of the forearm changes with the strength that you produce, and across all aspects of forearm position or hand position. You can see to the far right, men in the filled squares and circles and triangles are always steadier than women. This is particular data from the upper limb, but all I'm going to show as a quick glance on this screen is it doesn't matter what limb muscle we do, what task we look at, females are always less steady than males. So what is contributing to the underlying causes of these differences in force steadiness in the population that is far greater in females compared to males? Well, this difference could occur in the central nervous system, from the brain or the spinal cord. It could also occur in the peripheral nervous system, the nerves that exit the spinal cord. It also could occur at the muscle. So this is a particular drawing from a young scientist in my lab, showing a muscle as well as a tendon to highlight if we were to cut one of these structures in half and open it up, what we see in both cases are tiny little parts. And all of these parts could be contributing to how force control differs between males and females. But the other element that's important is what comes out of the spinal cord and goes to the muscle. The nerves could also be contributing. So the adaptation with age could occur at the brain, could occur at the spinal cord, could occur at the nerves that leave the spinal cord, could occur at the muscle, or could occur at the tendon. That's a lot of could occurs. So how do we deal with this? Well, that's where that isometric task is so important, because we can utilize it and with specific tools in the lab, decipher different levels that might be changing with age or between sexes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular slide. This is more a sciencey slide, if you will. But what I'm showing are these nerves that are exiting the spinal cord and going to the muscle. And what we know from the animal literature, there's not a lot of work done on humans. It's very difficult, and it's just evolving to show that the manner in which these nerves individually respond differ between males and females, and how the pool, meaning all of these nerves together work with age, actually change. And the key part to controlling force is not necessarily the individual nerves, but how those nerves work together as common elements. So that's one spot that we feel is undergoing, and we have some data to show is changing with age and likely differs between males and females. That is one aspect that's contributing to force control. The brain is another. I'm not showing a slide on that today, but the brain is very complex. And where we're studying the brain is not necessarily the organization of the thought to produce the movement, but the output of the thought. And we do know that that changes with age, and we're starting to explore how that differs between males and females. The next point I want to go back to, because it intersects with how the brain sends the command down, how strong that signal is, and how it interacts with the muscle at the peripheral level. And once again, I'm highlighting a graph. I don't want to lose sight of this, that the heavier the load you lift or the stronger you are, the steadier you are. So strength is an absolute factor as well as a predictor of how we can control force. What happens with age, as shown on the top left here, is a scan of a young muscle compared to an old muscle. And a lot of people will know and indicate that the outside of the muscle changes with age. What I want to highlight is the inside of the muscle also changes with age. The muscle mass decreases and there's this infiltration. There are these pockets, as you can see on the left bottom diagram right here, there's a lot more white. That's non-contractile muscle mass. It's not helping you produce strength. And what's really interesting is if you look at the top graph on the right, where I'm showing males and females, look what happens to a female in her legs at around the age of late 40s, early 50s. There's this abrupt decline in strength. But what data from our lab also showed is look at the males. This doesn't happen till the 70s. There's about a 20-year difference for this abrupt decline in strength. Interestingly enough, if we look at the arms, the abrupt decline in strength between females and males is rather similar. I do need to highlight this is data collected across the literature. And as you can see, we need a lot more work done on the arms compared to the legs. But generally, females decline greater in leg strength than arm strength. It occurs earlier, and this influences not only functional mobility, but force control, your ability to stand and maintain upright balance in a smooth and stable position. Now, this particular graph wants to show, these graphs and images want to highlight something that we often forget about that's going to go back to the importance of muscle strength. And that is, if you watch here, by a very steady hand, a trainee is capturing what's underneath the skin with respect to the muscle, as well as with respect to the tendon. And what we often forget about is the importance of the tendon, because when a muscle shortens, the tendon elongates. They're connected to each other. So that means the force that's produced in the muscle needs to transfer through the tendon to the bone to enable the muscle to contract. And what we're showing is that if you look at young compared to old, and I could change these around and make young the males and old the females, you can see that there's this decrease in your steadiness with age across force levels. But how does that relate to the tendon stress? Well, as you increase the stress in the tendon, you lower your CV of force, remembering that the lower the value your CV of force, the steadier the contraction. So as this muscle is shortening and the tendon is elongating, the longer it becomes, the tighter it becomes, and the greater the stress that's occurring within it at high forces. And the cross-sectional area is decreasing. So you have this lengthening of the tendon and a decreasing in cross-sectional area. It becomes really stiff like an elastic, and it enables the force to go through the tendon at a much smoother and more controlled manner. Part of that stress control is dependent upon the amount of force applied to the tendon and the amount of force that can be produced absolutely from the muscle. So strength is not only a factor at the level of the muscle, but at the level of the tendon. So what I've shown you so far, and very briefly at a high level, is that we have a lot more females than males as we become older. The literature has generally focused on males compared to females. And as we start to learn more about females, we're learning there's very specific places that females are adapting, and how their strength is changing is influencing not only their absolute functional mobility, which is contributing to a decline, but also that low force level of everyday activities of force control. Now, I don't want you to think that there's no hope. And in working with a lot of older females, they're resistant to strength training. And one of the challenges that we have is females start strength training too late. So we need to start it in our 50s, if not earlier. The stronger you are, the earlier you are, the better you are. But don't lose hope if you've passed that age of 50, for many of us. Because muscle strength, I hope I've shared, is a compelling reason to not only increase mobility, but those finite movements. And how do we know this can happen well into old age? Well, we did a particular study looking at one very special group of older females. They were pre-frail females. These women were on their way to becoming functionally dependent. Many of them were almost crossing over into the frail level. But we thought if we could increase strength, what would happen? And that's what I want to share with you today in the last 2 or so minutes, is that whether you're pre-frail or not shown on this slide, non-frail, being very robust and active, all the way to frail, there's an ability to change your strength, which can increase your functional performance. And this is not just mobility. Now, how did we do this? Well, we had these group of older women work out really hard. They did some stretching exercises, they did some aerobic exercises, and they lifted really heavily. They produced and performed movements that some people questioned us about at the time. But when you think about these heavy squatting exercises, and look at the number of dumbbells on here. Each one of these, I believe, is 25 pounds plus the bar weight. So this individual is lifting greater than 100 pounds. We were questioned, but then we reminded individuals, squatting is merely getting on and off the toilet. Lifting is only your groceries. But we had them do it really heavy, really strong for 9 weeks, 3 times a week. And what did we observe? Well, first off, if we look at the knee extension, and we did have a control group that didn't do anything, and we look at the absolute torque or force that's produced, in our control group, what you see over time is a slight decline. They maintain their normal activities. It's not that they did nothing, and they lost strength. Imagine that as yourself. You just maintain your daily life. Over a period of time, in this case, 9 weeks, you're losing your strength. But this group of exercisers, they increased it significantly. Not only did they increase their knee extension isometric strength, which means strength produced at one particular joint angle without a movement, is we had dynamic strength, meaning strength through a range of motion. And if you look once again on the far right on your exercise group, you see an increase from the gray bar to the dark black bar, showing that your exercise group increased strength. We looked at functional abilities, sit to stand. So on our baseline, there was a small difference between our groups, and I will say we tried to randomize our groups. Unfortunately, many of our control participants, you might say they were snowbirds, so they self-selected to the control group, but when they came back 9 weeks later, repeated their testing. The exercise group, though, over the period of 9 weeks, you can see the amount of time it took them to go from a seated position to a standing position drastically decreased. They became more efficient and faster at getting up and down in a sit-to-stand activity. Another indicator of performance of ability is gait speed. And once again, shown in the black bars, you can see that our exercise group got much faster. What I'm not showing you a slide of today is their functional ability. All of them reported greater independence, greater happiness, greater engagement, and greater activities of daily living after the exercise intervention. So what I can conclude is that exercise works. Exercise works to maintain your mobility, but stronger is also steadier. And that's really important for those everyday activities that we often neglect or forget to remember. I want to thank you for your time today. It's been a very quick walk through a very large area of research. I'm happy to address any questions here, as well as through our websites. You can gain more information, or through our social media accounts. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this, Dr. Jakobi. It's so interesting to see the sex differences in motor function with aging, and really interesting to see how stark some of these differences can be, and how it can inform sort of the development and promotion of exercise programs, including even programs like our very own Brain Wellness program. So I think especially those last few slides really emphasize how valuable exercise is, which is something our program really values. So we have a few quick questions before we let you go, which we would love to have you answer. One, we were wondering if there are any lifestyle factors that may mediate the difference in decline with strength in men versus women. You mentioned baseline sort of exercise level a little bit. Could you maybe expand on that, or some other lifestyle factors that may come into play?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I always take a moment to pause when I address this, because lifestyle factors, if we think about a person aging, all of us are aging, but a 50-year-old compared to a 60-year-old, the benefits that we've had in life with respect to technology are much different than our 80 and our 90-year-olds. So I take pause to identify the fact that what we do on a day-to-day basis impacts how we age and who we are as we become older. So I put a caveat around that, because if an individual, let's say, was a laborer in their younger life, performing much more strenuous tasks, that is one factor. So they will build up strength. If you look at, let's just say, the female population alone, and I'm drawing sweeping conclusions here on two different levels, we have many females who are in their 80s and 90s who chose or did not chose, but spent their life as their primary job was caregivers. They cared for their spouse, they cared for their family, they looked after others, they worked in the home. That particular job was very different from other females who might have had administrative jobs. So the level of daily activity, physical activity, which is different than exercise, impacts how we age. The more active we are, the younger we are, the stronger we are, typically for various reasons, inclusive of absolute strength, the longer we live. Addition to that, there's nutritional factors and there's stressors. Many of us have heard about, but have not lived the life that 80 and 90-year-olds have lived, inclusive of 70-year-olds. Let's not forget, they've lived through war, they've lived through depression, and now they've lived through the COVID pandemic. They are a special group of agers. So that part of lifestyle really created a unique element compared to myself, who's in the 50s, that will not experience, but need to really respect. So all of that is to say stress, and they've experienced a lot if they're in their 80s and 90s and continue to do so. Technology, nutrition, and inclusive of nutrition, I've identified a war. Well, within the war, there was rationing. So we know right now, periods of fasting benefit our health. They had periods of fasting. It might have been imposed upon them in many cases, but they did. So there were elements of lifestyle that absolutely imparted young age all the way to old age. And when we consider aging, let's not put our 60-year-olds with our 90-year-olds, because they're very different based upon lifestyle factors. I hope that addressed the question.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Jakobi. One last quick question. One question came up wondering if the abrupt decline in strength in females may correlate with menopause?
Yeah, and quite often when I show that slide, the line that I'll use is the easy out in this answer is hormones. So yes, menopause is part of the difference. And we do know there's a drastic change in hormones. But let's not look at hormones just at the level of menopause. Let's rewind it to the fact when you're in the active years of menstruation, there is this massive flux in estrogen, progesterone, all of the female hormones. The higher levels of estrogen compared to the higher levels of testosterone in males, pardon me, sometimes putting men and males together results in a very interesting word. Males, testosterone builds strength. So it's not just menopause, it's the fact men have testosterone at higher levels earlier on, so they gain more strength. Then when menopause hits, there's this kind of dual fold in decline in hormonal levels, and there's various different ways that culminates. So to say menopause is only one contributing factor, the pre-factor really is hormones on a whole basis, and then in addition to hormonal factors, there's various other factors that coincide with menopause. The hot flashes create stress, create discomfort. They then create changes in exercise pattern. They create changes in food patterns. So it's not just the hormones itself, it's the rolling effect of the hormones throughout the lifespan.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Dr. Jakobi. And thank you for joining us here today. It was really lovely to learn from you, and we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for the invitation. It was lovely to share.
Perfect. Next up, we have Dr. Annalise Laplume, who is a postdoctoral researcher at McGill University, as well as the Geriatrics Institute of the University of Montreal. She's received a master's and PhD in psychology at York University, in addition to graduate diplomas in quantitative methods and neuroscience. Currently, she is co-supervised by the lovely Dr. Natasha Raja, who is unable to be here with us today, and Dr. Sylvie Belleville, where she studies how cognitive abilities and memory-related brain wiring varies with aging. She also studies how individual differences, such as sex differences, which will be included in the discussion today, shape these areas of brain function. So welcome, Dr. Laplume, and I'll pass it off to you.
Great, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for coming here today. So today I'm going to talk about aging and brain health, and I'll cover what's normal and what's not when it comes to aging and brain health. And then I'll look at ways to keep your brain healthy over life. And I'll end with how these things are different between men and women. So when you hear of aging, sometimes when people talk about it, or even in movies, it's often quite negative. So people will talk about aging as it all being downhill. So if I were to sketch this idea out, you might think of it as mental performance. In childhood, it starts to improve. Then it sort of peaks in adulthood, and then it starts to decline in old age. And this idea that people have is very symmetrical. So they sort of think of old age as childhood in reverse. And this idea isn't new. It was introduced as early as Shakespeare. In one of his most famous play monologues, he talks about all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. So what Shakespeare is saying is that life is like a play of 7 stages, starting with childhood, ending with old age. And he describes old age as the final stage as a form of second childhood. So again, he's talking about aging as simply childhood, but in reverse. But in reality, this may be true for physical activities, so your height is at its peak after childhood, and your muscle strength and reaction time may peak in young adulthood. Although, as we just heard, that there's still room for improvement. But with cognitive abilities, it's not the case that it's all downhill. Some mental abilities actually peak later in life. So this is a much more realistic depiction of what happens. So when it comes to intelligence, we have 2 types. We have fluid and crystallized intelligence, which is information processing abilities like memory or attention, being able to respond quickly or logical processing. And then we have crystallized intelligence, which is information or knowledge that you learn. So while fluid intelligence does seem to show a rise and fall over life, crystallized intelligence rises until adulthood and then stays the same or is maintained. So even with fluid intelligence, it rises very rapidly. So your memory and attention develop quickly in childhood, and then it declines very slowly. So it's not just the opposite. Meanwhile, crystallized intelligence increases and is maintained later in life. So this collection of knowledge and experience over life is a scientific way of what we would call wisdom in your later years. Now, the same thing happens if we look at individual cognitive skills or mental skills. Some things, like how fast you respond or how well you can learn, are at their peak in the teens and 20s. But other abilities, like recognizing faces or social understanding, start to peak in midlife. And verbal knowledge is really at its peak later in life, as you've accumulated the most amount of words and information. So another thing that I learned in my own research is that it's not all downhill with age. There's always trade-offs in life, and we see people compensate for the functions that do decline. So my own research studying tens of thousands of people finds that while young adults and teenagers are often the quickest to respond, so they're great at speed, they tend to prioritize speed over everything else. So they'll have the highest number of mistakes. Meanwhile, older adults will slow down, but they'll make far fewer mistakes than their younger counterparts. Another trade-off that we see is that in young adulthood, people can hold lots of information in mind. Later in life, memory is trickier, but to compensate for that, older adults will pay much more attention to their environment or cues, and they'll often notice things around them that younger people might miss because they weren't paying attention to what was around them. So these trade-offs that we see with aging show that it's far more complex than a single downhill line. Some skills worsen, but other skills improve. And so you have this sort of compensation later in life. Now, a big part of changes in aging is memory. Maybe you lose your keys often or forget why you walked into a room. These happen to me all the time. And you wonder, is this normal or is something else going on? So it is completely normal to see some changes in your memory as you age. And I'll show you some examples of what's normal and what's not from one of Canada's leading aging and memory researchers. So it's normal to forget a person's name. I do this all the time. But what's not so normal is forgetting the name of a loved one. And this is not once or twice, but if this is frequently happening. It's normal to get lost in new places. What's less normal is getting lost in a place you know well, such as your home. It's normal to forget to buy an item when you go to the store. It's not so normal to forget that you went to the store. It's normal to forget why you walked into a room, especially when you've got lots of other things on your mind as you're going about your everyday tasks. But it's not so normal to be able to forget, not to be able to have problems with focus or forget everyday tasks. It's normal to tell the same story or joke on different occasions. And I do this all the time with my husband. I keep repeating stories. But it's not normal to tell the same story or joke within a single conversation. It's normal to not remember the exact date, but it's not so normal to be completely disoriented in times, for example, thinking that it's the 1950s. And then these are all those examples again. So these are just examples. They're not diagnostic. Only a medical professional can identify actual problems. But I just put them up to show that changes in memory as you age are completely normal. And, little slip-ups here and there are part of aging. Another thing we know that's normal is that aging isn't the same for everyone. So what's normal for one person could be different for another person. So we can think of aging as more of a range than a single trend. So if we look at these dots in the middle, these would maybe show you the general trend, but then we have this whole gray zone. That's the zone of possible performance. So we have the upper limits, which are optimal performance. So that's, the performing really well compared to other people the same age. And then we have the bottom limits, which is suboptimal performance, performing maybe less well than other people of the same age. And you can see that for each age I put arrows, and that's because, we can move up and down at any given point in our life at any age. So performance isn't set, it's changeable for people across ages. The brain's very plastic and it learns and can improve over time. And biological and environmental factors play a big part in whether we move upward to our optimal performance or downward to suboptimal, and I'll cover some of those factors. We could also imagine that there's a threshold below which mental performance is compromised to such a point that it impacts our everyday functioning. So this could eventually mean getting a diagnosis of something such as dementia. And so here's another example of what 4 different people could look like. So they all start out at the same point at age 20. But then as they go on, person A, starts to reach maybe a high level of mental performance or cognition. So when I say cognition, I refer to any mental skills. And then later they start to decline. Person B doesn't really improve. They sort of stay the same. And then what's interesting with person C is maybe in their 60s, they start to implement some positive lifestyle activities. Maybe they get exercise. And so then they start to stabilize or even improve compared to person B. So you can see that the trajectory you take over life can change at any point for any given person. So now you may be wondering, how do we aim for optimal performance at our age? How do we reach that higher level of the gray region? So one of the most revolutionary findings in aging and dementia research is that it's not set. So sometimes people think, if you have a relative with dementia, you'll probably get it. But in reality, although there's a genetic component, lifestyle and environment play a big role. So what we know from the latest collection of dementia research is that at least 40% of dementias are due to lifestyle factors. And the best part is these lifestyle factors are changeable. So they accumulate over your life from early life to midlife to later life, and they add up to influence aging and the risk of dementia. And here are some of those changeable lifestyle factors. So in early life, getting education, so completing high school. In midlife, it could be things like treating hearing loss, treating high blood pressure. And in later life, it's things like stopping smoking, getting some exercise or physical activity. And I'm going to look at those factors in a little more detail. So one set of factors that's beneficial for your brain health is anything that's mentally stimulating, things that exercise your mind. So in younger life, this could be completing high school, getting an education. It could also be having a job over adulthood. And research even shows that the later a person retires, the better their mental performance compared to other people of the same age. And the reason that retiring later could be beneficial is that having a job is mentally stimulating, so it exercises your brain. But in addition to a job, it could also be leisure activities that challenge the brain, such as reading or doing puzzles. So you may have heard the phrase, use it or lose it, and this applies to cognitive aging. The more you use your brain as you get older, the more active it stays. Now, one of the biggest risk factors for aging more rapidly and for dementia is untreated hearing loss. So you might wonder, well, what does hearing loss have to do with the brain? So it could be because not treating hearing loss, so say not getting a hearing aid, means you're missing out on mentally stimulating activities. So, if you can't listen to conversations, you can't participate, you may not attend events, you may leave your home less. And so that's why untreating hearing loss may prevent you from mentally stimulating activities. Another area of activities that are beneficial is anything that's good for your cardiovascular health, so for your body. So we've just heard about how exercise is beneficial. And it's good not just for your body, but also for your brain. In fact, taking a walk every day or getting some kind of physical activity is really beneficial for your memory and for your attention. So the largest effects on the brain are seen from aerobic activities, but there's also unique benefits from resistance training on the brain. And then separately, although linked, tackling obesity also has a benefit. In addition, things that improve your physical health, so managing diabetes and high blood pressure, are beneficial for the brain. So this doesn't say having high blood pressure is bad. It just says managing it is good. So it's okay to have it. It's pretty common as people get older, but what's important is to manage it with a doctor. The same with diabetes. It's also beneficial to stop smoking. This one's really difficult, I know, but the good news is that it has a really large effect. So when people quit smoking, a year or two later, they start to see benefits on their memory and attention. And 5 years after quitting smoking, their memory and attention is often similar to people who never smoked. So it looks like some of those effects of smoking on cognition are reversible. And then lastly, we also have social factors. So depression and social isolation each separately increase the risk of dementia, and they also influence cognitive aging. So in one of the largest long-term studies that was done, scientists looked at several hundred people starting from the Great Depression, and they tracked them over time. They looked at their health and life events such as getting married. And their findings, which surprised them, was that our relationships and how happy we are in our relationships has a really powerful influence on our health. So they found that close relationships, even more than money or fame, are what keeps people happy through their lives. Relationship ties protect people from life stresses and discontents. They help to delay mental and physical decline, and they're better predictors of long and happy lives than even IQ or genes. So this was true across the board, regardless of people's upbringing or their social class or their background. What they found is that it wasn't their middle-age cholesterol levels that predicted how they were going to grow old. It's how satisfied they were in their relationships. The people who were most satisfied in their relationships at age 50 were the healthiest at age 80. And this could be, being married or having a partner, but it could also be relationships with friends or your community. So it's different kinds of close relationships. And here are some quotes from the lead researchers in that study. They say, loneliness kills. It's as powerful as smoking or alcoholism. When the study began, nobody cared about empathy or attachment. But the key to healthy aging is relationships, relationships, relationships. So each of these factors that I've covered has an effect, but their effects also add up and compound together. So I recently ran a study where we added up the number of factors that a person had and then looked at their memory and attention. So we did this for over 40,000 people of different ages. So we found that each risk factor lowered a person's cognitive performance, so they could remember stuff less well, or they had more trouble focusing. With each factor having the effect of 3 years of aging. So for example, a non-smoker aged 50 had the same mental performance as somebody who smoked, but was 3 years older. But then in addition, the factors compound. So here's people of different ages and their mental performance, where a higher score is better. So you can see that as people get older, their performance starts to decline. But for people with the fewest risk factors, that's the purple line, they consistently perform better than people who had many risk factors. And the more risk factors you have, the lower performance went. So this is important because sometimes people think factors cancel each other out. So it might be a smoker and think, I know I smoke, but it's okay because I exercise often and I wear a hearing aid. But what the takeaway message from this shows is that the fewer factors, the better. So we should really try to reduce any and all risk factors. And the really good news about this picture and our findings is that age is not the whole picture. There were people in their 60s who had no risk factors, and they did as well as people who were 20 or 30 years younger. So people aged 40 to 50 with no risk factors had similar mental performance to those aged 20 to 30, but with 3 risk factors. Then again, people aged 50 to 60 with no risk factors had similar mental performance to people aged 40 to 50 with 3 risk factors. So trying to minimize your risk factors can really help your brain offset some of those effects of aging. one way of thinking about this is by building a protective reserve. So let's say you're driving and then you see the fuel light come on, showing that you have low fuel. Your vehicle doesn't stop immediately. You know that you can still go a bit longer, sometimes quite a bit longer, before your car is going to stop. And that's because you have a reserve fuel tank that, is about 10% of your entire fuel and allows you to keep going despite your vehicle being almost out of fuel. So researchers think something similar to this reserve tank happens in the brain, and they call this brain reserve or cognitive reserve. So all the beneficial activities that we do over our life, such as keeping our minds active or our bodies active, having those social ties, these build up a protective cognitive reserve, and this shields our brain from aging or diseases such as dementia. And what's crazier is that there might be two people who both have biological signs of dementia, or both may be the same age, but they may not show the same amount of decline. So the person who has more reserve factors or those protective lifestyle activities would have higher cognitive performance than someone who didn't have those factors. So now the last thing I'm going to cover is how those things differ between men and women. So when studying over 40,000 people, I found that overall men have more risk factors. They also have different types of factors. So men tend to be smokers. They tend to engage in substance abuse and diabetes. Women and have hearing loss. On the other hand, women, they live longer. And we know that age is the biggest risk factor for dementia. That's why as life expectancies go up, dementia rates go up. The most common risk factors in women are also depression and high blood pressure. And again, these are untreated. So untreated high blood pressure, untreated hearing loss. If you treat it, then that's okay for your brain. When it comes to cognitive functions or mental functions, we also see a few differences between men and women, but most of these are very small and they're so subtle that they may not even be obvious in day-to-day life. The biggest difference is that men overall do better on visual spatial abilities, women on verbal abilities. These are just general. It might not apply to every single man and woman, but on average, men are better on visual spatial tasks, women are better on verbal. We also see differences in their strategies. So men will tend to respond quickly from the start and have the same speed across the task. Women vary in their speed. They'll start slower and then they'll build up speed as the task goes on, as they gain in confidence. The largest differences are usually more on social aspects of cognition or mental functioning. So women are better at processing facial cues, recognizing emotions and empathy, while as men have a slight advantage in perceiving negative emotions. So things like anger, aggression, threatening cues, men are better at perceiving those ones. And these differences are seen across ages. Now, an area where we do see pretty big differences is on memory. So memory is remembering events is a common part of everyday life. So let's say, one day you meet these three people. You're probably going to have to remember their faces and their names. So you have to remember the association between each person's face and their name. Women tend to be better at this. They tend to be better at remembering events and remembering links between people's faces and names. And they also show less decline on the ability to remember these things, which is good because remembering events worsens in aging and in Alzheimer's disease. And women tend to be better at this. But despite that, women are at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. So 2 out of 3 of people with Alzheimer's disease are women. So we often wonder why that's the case. If women have better memory and less decline in their memory, why do they have a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease, which is, a hallmark of that is worse memory. So one reason that our lab thought that might be the case is because of these modifiable risk factors. So we looked at how having risk factors had an effect on mental performance in men and women. And what we found is that in people with no risk factors, women tended to have better memory and better mental performance than men, and they had less aging than men. But in people with many risk factors, women declined a lot faster than men. So it looked like those negative consequences of having lifestyle risk factors are bigger for women than men. And this may explain why more women have Alzheimer's disease than men. So going back to that idea of your protective cognitive reserve, men tend to be more likely to have protective factors that build up a reserve. So men tend to have more education than women historically. They tend to have more occupational attainment than women, and they tend to be more physically active than women. Women are more likely to have social connections, which is also beneficial. And although research looking at how cognitive reserve differs between men and women is still in its early stages, some findings so far suggest that these protective factors, such as getting more education or having a stimulating job, may benefit women more than men. So women may see, both sexes see benefits from these factors, but women may see larger benefits. So in conclusion, aging is not the whole picture. Age-related changes in memory and other mental abilities are different from one person to another, and lifestyle factors play a big role in these differences. So the lifestyle factors influence aging, and they influence the risk of getting dementia. And although age and sex can't be changed, the effect of lifestyle factors is as large or larger than some of the effects of age and sex. So you should think of it as prevention's better than cure. It's important to address any and all risk factors, regardless of your age, to help your mental performance. And this is important for both men and women, but the effects are notably larger in women. And overall, the revelation from studies on happiness and longevity is that taking care of your mind and your body is important, but tending to your relationships is a form of self-care too. So I'll end where we started with Shakespeare and some more wholesome quotes on aging and wisdom from him, and how aging is more than a second childhood, but it's rather a beautiful stage of life in its own way. And I'd like to thank my supervisors and lab colleagues that I've worked with, as well as my funding agencies that sponsor my research. And thank you to you for attending and for giving me this opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Laplume, for sharing your expertise on aging and the brain. It is so great to learn about some very tangible ways to minimize risks of dementia, and also really interesting to hear about these sex differences in your findings. I think both your talk and Dr. Jakobi's talk really emphasizes how important it is to pay attention to these sex differences while both conducting and critiquing research. We'll just move on to one quick question from the audience that came up in the chat, are there any studies on differences in specific genes that may be behind differences in mental functions, or is it more largely hormonal and lifestyle based, like both you and Dr. Jakobi touched on?
It's a really good question, and thank you for asking it. It's a combination of both. So a quote I've heard that I like to say is that genes load the gun and environment fires the trigger. So, genes set you off on a certain path. And although we don't have a single gene linked to Alzheimer's disease or your cognitive performance as you age, there are a number of genes that, may predispose a person to be more likely to age in a certain way or get Alzheimer's disease. But it's not set. We've seen people with biological signs of Alzheimer's disease who don't show any of the problems with memory that you'd expect. And that's because they lead very healthy lifestyles. So that's the hopeful news from research. Although there is a genetic component, it's not the whole picture. And you can, make up for a genetic predisposition to aging in a certain way or Alzheimer's disease by implementing positive lifestyle activities.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Dr. Laplume. It has been so valuable learning from you, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
That is unfortunately all the time we have today. So I want to give one last thank you to both of our wonderful speakers for sharing their expertise with us. And I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today as well. It has been a great pleasure learning alongside you all. And I would also like to wish everyone a very happy Women's Health Month. So I'll finish off with just one last big thank you again to both of our speakers and everyone today. And with that, we will say goodbye for now. Thank you, everyone.